Hi, I'm Dirk. This is Religion for the Rest of Us. And today I wanted to talk about an idea that gets thrown around a lot that people don't usually think about when they say, and don't usually think about when people say it to them, but I think it's an important concept relative to understanding what religion is actually all about. And to get at this idea, I want to talk about a phrase that I think most people have heard at some point in their lives, which is everything happens for a reason. It's trite and it's insulting, and something people usually say when someone they know has experienced some kind of a tragedy. Some unfortunate event has happened, and in order to make the person who's experienced this tragedy feel better, and maybe mostly to make themselves feel better, people will express this sentiment. Everything happens for a reason. It's a cliche. It's as though, if your wife left you, it must be because Emma Stone wants to date you. Or if you lost your job, well, Apple must be hiring. If your dog died, maybe a lassie needs a home. It's generally used as a way of telling somebody that the bad things that happen to them really aren't that bad in the grand scheme of things, and there's something good right around the corner. But it also means something. And in spite of it being trite and cliche, it could also be true. And in order to figure that out, I want to break apart what it could mean. After taking a look at what it could mean, I think we also want to take a look at what the implications are if it is true, and what the implications are if it's not true. So let's start by trying to figure out, what does this phrase mean? Well, I think it could mean one of three things. The first possible meaning, when we say everything happens for a reason, is that everything has a cause. Whatever happens, there was something that happened before that made that thing happen. Now, I don't think this is what people usually mean when they say everything happens for a reason to somebody who's experienced some horrible tragedy. It could still be true in this context, and it certainly is. Everything does have a cause. If you get cancer, there's something that caused that cancer. We might not know what that is, but it comes from somewhere. It's also tied to this idea of karma, which from a theological perspective isn't one I'm entirely comfortable with, because when we say something like, oh, karma's a bitch, we're kind of saying that anything bad that happens to somebody, they deserved it. And that's not always the case. And to suggest that it's always karma, that there's some moral culpability that a person has that can explain the bad things that happen to them, is a really problematic idea, especially if we're looking at it from a strictly Hindu perspective, where we're talking about somebody's past life and sins and crimes that they may have committed before they even existed in this current state. It means that somebody born into poverty deserves to be in that situation. And because they deserve to be in that situation, we're not really obligated to help them. So that's one possible meaning of everything happens for a reason, but that's not really the meaning I want to get into. And I don't think it's really what people mean when they say to somebody, everything happens for a reason after experiencing some sort of tragedy. What they usually mean is that there's some unforeseen outcome waiting down the road that could only happen if you'd experienced this particular tragedy. And that this bad thing that happened to you is really a good thing because it's opening up the door to something else, something new, some possibility that's going to change your life for the better. I'm not sure how I feel about this idea. It almost suggests that we don't have any real control over our lives. And maybe we don't. It's a hopeful idea, but it's also one that limits our freedom. So I also want to suggest a third possibility. That's when we say everything happens for a reason. What we really mean is everything has meaning. And I'm not sure if that's what people usually mean. In fact, I don't think it is what people usually mean when they say everything happens for a reason. But I do think we need to look at whether or not this is true. And the reason I want to talk about this within the context of religion is that I think that looking for a reason for the things that happen to us, searching for meaning, is ultimately what the religious pursuit is about. At least it's what it should be about. I know it's not for everybody, but I think that's how it began. It wasn't simply a matter of people wanting to explain why it rained, why the seasons changed, why the sun came up and went down. It wasn't simply people trying to explain what they could not explain scientifically. I think there's something deeper to it. I think it's the very human need to feel as though there is a reason that things happen to us, that there's meaning behind it. So we need to decide, or at least ask the question, is this true or not? And I think the options are either everything happens for a reason, or nothing happens for a reason. Or some things happen for a reason and some things don't. But I think we can rule out that last possibility fairly easily if we look at it. If there is some sort of divine being, a god, or an intelligence to the universe that governs whether or not things do or do not happen for a reason, and some things happen for a reason and some things don't, then it's almost an even more random and chaotic universe that we live in than if everything is absolutely completely random and nothing happens for a reason. Because it means that there is some sort of divine being that really is sort of indifferent. There's a divine being, but that divine being doesn't really care about everything. If some things happen for a reason and some things don't, it means that whatever it is that controls what happens for a reason and what doesn't happen for any reason doesn't really care about everything or everybody. It's sort of like the pantheon of Greek gods, where there are certain human beings that they take an interest in, but for the most part, they don't really care. They influence certain events, and then other times they're just off doing their thing, completely oblivious and unconcerned about what's going on in the day-to-day lives of most human beings. And I don't think the universe works that way. If there is a God, I think we have to assume that God cares about everyone and everything. And if there's not, well, then things just happen the way they happen. And there's no explaining it. And there's no use looking for a reason in anything. So let's look at the first two. I think that for most of my life, I assumed that the universe was entirely random. And I could exert a certain amount of control over it. But when it came down to it, when I really looked at it rationally, anything can go wrong at any moment. The things I care about and the people I care about could be taken away from me in an instant, and there'd be no meaning behind it. And I think this is sort of what the Buddhists are getting at when they talk about attachment. Being attached to anything in this world is irrational. Because if we attach ourselves to things that we can't depend on, that could be taken away from us at any moment for no perceivable reason, then we're just going to be unhappy. We're going to be insecure about things all the time. Once we start to value our connections to other people, to the things that we have, to the life that we lead, and if we look at it rationally and we think, all of these things could go away at any moment, then caring about them becomes foolish. And there's nothing we can hold on to, nothing that matters, nothing that means anything. The only thing we can do is try to abstract ourselves from our own emotions, the natural feelings we have for that which is familiar to us. Because it is within all of us to care about the things that we know and love, what has sustained us and given us the perception of meaning throughout our lives, be it work or family or artistic pursuits or pleasure or whatever it is. At the end of reason, we have to accept that from a rational standpoint, it's all vapor. And there's nothing we can really hold on to in a meaningful way. This is the most rational way to look at it. There's no scientific reason to think that anything means anything. So if we say everything happens for a reason, and this is the other option, if we're going to rule out the third, then it's got to be either everything happens for a reason or nothing happens for a reason. It requires a leap of faith to assert that everything does in fact happen for a reason. It's not something that you can prove. It's not something that's meant to be proven. And this is where I want to go back to the idea of saying that everything happens for a reason really means everything has meaning. And when we talk about meaning, we're not talking about something that can be established scientifically. Meaning is something that is a function of language. And it really has to do with being able to tell a story about what happens to us and what happens in our lives. It's that story that we tell and the ability to give the events in our lives and in our experience meaning through a narrative that we can share with other people that connects us to them. In this situation, we need to make a choice to say that our lives have meaning and to define what that meaning is and to look at the things that happen to us in a way that makes them meaningful and talk about them to other people in a way that makes them meaningful to them. And when we're talking about the validity of religion, I think that we need to understand religion Not as though it were somehow competing with science, but that it fills this entirely different role of helping us ascribe meaning to what we experience. Science deals in causality. Science is a way of explaining why things happen the way that they do. But it doesn't ever attempt to explain what things mean, because the laws of science exist without language. And if human beings and our amazing linguistic capability were to vanish from the universe would still function according to whatever the laws of science are. They don't need us to participate. But in order for there to be meaning, there has to be beings that can understand and communicate and tell stories and use language in a way to explain what they experience and what happens to them. So I think in this way, we have to decide for ourselves whether or not everything happens for a reason. And in making that decision, we're also deciding what kind of a story we want to tell. Because it is the stories that we tell that give meaning to our experience. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that if in our lives we feel like the events that happen to us have no meaning, it is a failure on our part to give them meaning and to find a way to express and communicate why our own experiences are meaningful. Once we start to take a hard, purely rational, atheist view of things, we're giving up the possibility of shaping meaning and creating meaning within our own lives. And I don't want to suggest that you can't be an atheist and lead a meaningful life, but in order to do that, you have to allow some space to explain what happens to you in a way that can't necessarily be proven. And this is the tricky part. There's never proof for meaning. It's always personal. And it can be shared. In sharing meaning, in sharing a story, two human beings in their completely separate and isolated experiences of their own existence and themselves in the world, can start to overcome that gap and that separation. And it's something that science can't accomplish. It was never really meant to. But it's something that's absolutely necessary for us as human beings to overcome our differences. And if ultimately our goal is to make the world and our existence better, not only for ourselves, but for everyone, we need to be able to explore how we make these meaningful connections. And religion at its best is designed to do that. It is an attempt to bring people together in this shared experience of exchanging meaning and stories about what our existence means. At its worst, it does exactly the opposite and simply divides us from each other. For now, I think this is a good start. I want to thank you all for watching. Check out the show notes, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Follow my Tumblr, whatiremembered.com. Don't forget to subscribe. There'll be more episodes. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon.